Welcome to the Ask the Geographer podcast series, brought to you by the Education Department at the Royal Geographical Society with IBG. I'm Rachel, your host, and in each episode, I'll be joined by geographers from across the globe to delve into current events, publications, and research all tied to the fascinating world of geography. Hello and welcome to another episode of Ask the Geographer podcast, where today we are joined by Dr. David Anderson. David is a geography education specialist who has extensive experience both in and out of the classroom. He has been co-author of undergraduate and A-level textbooks, published over 30 works, and has written online educational resources on topics including glaciation, geological timescales, and the future of Venice. Following on from a degree in environmental science from the University of Denver, David did his doctoral research in physical geography at Oxford. David joins us today to talk about the importance of wetlands and how they can provide a nature-based solution to many of the issues the planet is experiencing. David, thanks so much for joining us today and welcome to the podcast.
Andy, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
So David, before we get into the main topic of wetlands, we understand that you've been involved in several other areas of study. Can you give us an overview of some of those areas?
Yeah, happy to. My interest in wetlands grew out of my undergraduate and postgraduate studies of environmental change. Wetlands fit into this because they're environments with excellent preservation of biological and chemical forms of evidence that can be used for reconstructing environmental changes of the past. While I was an undergraduate, I learned some of the research methods, and then for my doctoral work, I was fortunate to have the opportunity to apply them on peatland sediment cores that I collected from northwest Scotland. And by analyzing these cores for a range of indicators and by radiocarbon dating samples from different depths, I was able to construct a vegetational and environmental history for the area, stretching from the present back more than 10,000 years. And I also examined past hydrological changes and measured carbon accumulation rates. More broadly, I've studied and written about the Quaternary period, which is the last 2.6 million years of Earth history, which has seen dramatic oscillations in the extent of glaciers worldwide that are correlated with numerous other profound environmental changes. I've also written educational materials on cold environments and on how glacial and periglacial processes shape landscapes. On historic timescales, I've always been fascinated by dynamic and delicate environments that human societies have attempted to manage. The link between the city of Venice and the Venice Lagoon offers a prime example, and in recent years, I've taken field trips and created teaching resources that focus on this unique place. And through this work, I've been fortunate to collaborate with the NGO We Are Here Venice and with people involved in the Wetlands project, which is something we'll return to a little later.
Fantastic. I'd like to ask a little bit more about the Venice project, if possible. Could you give us a bit more information about the Venice Lagoon?
Sure. The Venice Lagoon is, in fact, the Mediterranean Sea's largest natural lagoon, and it sits between the mainland, where the Po Valley is, and the Adriatic Sea. And it's a very dynamic environment. So it's, of course, dates from post-glacial times as sea level rose with the melting of the great ice sheets. And it's an environment which sees lots of deposition off of the Po Valley. A series of mudflats and islands are formed. And at the time of the fall of the Roman Empire, the Venetians, who like to consider themselves the true Romans, fled the mainland because of the invading tribes from the north, and they settled the islands at the time that Imperial Rome was collapsing. And then they built their great city in that incredible, fragile lagoon ecosystem, trying to manage the sediment flows to hit the right balance between having a defensive position, so deep enough that invading armies couldn't attack, but yet not so shallow that they couldn't get their ships in and out of the lagoon.
So, by the sounds of it, it's quite a combination of nature, of creating these spaces, but actually humans manipulating those spaces as well.
Very much so. So it's a natural environment, a dynamic environment. Coastal lagoons in particular are constantly adjusting to sediment flows and sea level and the river inputs. And the Venetians over centuries have attempted to manage this with a remarkable degree of success, actually. And we had the good fortune on a field trip to go to the National Archives in Venice and to actually see some of the medieval, or well, let's say late medieval maps that were drawn up of the lagoon at the time, and also some of the schemes for changing the direction of rivers, so to avoid silting up around the harbors. Interestingly, the problem today is that the Venice Lagoon is becoming more like a bay of the sea now. And so now they're trying to reverse engineer so that you get more sediment into the lagoon. The previous problem was too much sedimentation. Now the problem is not enough sediment.
Oh, I see. So it's a balancing act, really. And I love the fact that you've actually had an opportunity to be looking over historical evidence, particularly in maps, as geographers love to look at maps. But it's really clearly showing the interaction that humans have had with that natural landscape.
Absolutely. It's not a new thing to try to manage the environment.
What exactly is a wetland, and what are the different types?
Well, it's not easy to give a simple definition owing to their great variety. But generally speaking, a wetland is a transitional environment, somewhere between being dry land and a water body. There's saturation or inundation by water much of the time, although water levels often vary throughout the year. The most widely recognized classification of wetland types across the world is the Ramsar wetland typology. And this scheme arose from the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, which is an international treaty promoting the conservation and wise use of wetlands that was negotiated at the city of Ramsar in Iran in 1971. Interestingly, it happens to be the oldest intergovernmental environmental agreement. The Ramsar scheme applies a broad definition of wetlands and splits them into three main groups: marine coastal, inland, and human-made. The marine coastal group includes types such as salt marshes, mangrove swamps, and tidal swamp forests. The inland group includes forested and non-forested peatlands, and the human-made group includes rice paddies and ponds for aquaculture, for example. There are many other types in each group besides these, and each type can in turn be classified into subtypes according to factors such as the source of water, the nutrient status, and the species composition. For instance, in the UK, non-forested peatlands include bogs and fens. Peat bogs form in areas of high rainfall and are therefore nutrient-poor ecosystems with a low pH. Sphagnum mosses thrive in this habitat, whereas fens have a high contribution of groundwater and are therefore more nutrient-rich with a higher pH. And the dominant plants in fens are reeds, sedges, and rushes. So there are a lot of ways to classify wetlands, many different aspects to them.
Does that classification make it harder to be able to identify wetlands from other physical landscapes sometimes?
I think that's a really good question. I think it's important to have an international agreement on the classifications. Otherwise, you can't track change over long periods of time because you need to compare like with like. But there is a real problem with classifying a type of ecosystem that, in fact, has got transitional features. Inevitably in nature, there's going to be fine gradations between one type and another. And not everyone is going to agree on a precise definition. But the Ramsar is a good example because it is an international scheme that's widely applied.
Sure. Okay, I get that. So a lot of our geographers that are listening, if they're A-level students or if they're teachers, will be looking at wetlands within the UK. You mentioned a little bit about the UK. So what would be the things that they would maybe mainly find in the UK for them?
The UK would be, I suppose, best known worldwide for its blanket bog habitat and its raised bogs. There are many lowland fens as well in England and the UK in general. So the reason for this is that, of course, as we know and love, the British Isles, particularly the western and upland regions, get a lot of rain. The climate is quite cool. So it really is the perfect habitat for this type of peat bog. And between the UK and Ireland, they account for about 20% of the world's blanket bog habitat. The blanket bogs are found at relatively high elevations along slopes in the uplands. And raised bogs, on the other hand, are formed actually in the lowlands, but in areas where it rains so much, they become raised in the sense of dome-like in shape because the decomposition rates are slower than the growth of the peatland plants on top. And over time, the raised bog, the wetland, ultimately grows to a higher elevation than the area surrounding it. And provided that the rainfall remains high and the climate remains cool, and it's not drained, for human use, then it's a system that will maintain itself for a very long time.
So they're quite distinct looking if you were to go out into the field, so to speak, to go and see them. They're quite distinct in their appearance.
Yeah, I would say so. They're not often in the most accessible places, so I'm not sure how many people would have an image of one in their minds, but if you know what to look for.
Wonderful. And so thinking about our wetlands globally, and we'll get onto the UK in a minute, what's the current status of these wetlands?
Well, unfortunately, wetland ecosystems are among the most threatened ecosystems in the world. And Ramsar, the Convention on Wetlands, estimates that about 411 million hectares have been lost since 1970, which represents a 22% reduction of the global area of wetland that existed in that year. They currently estimate an annual rate of loss of 0.52%. So globally, wetlands are in decline. And this, of course, varies, though, with the type of wetland. To look at a longer time scale, if we look at salt marsh, only about half of salt marsh exists today compared to pre-industrial times. In the UK, about 85% of salt marsh has been lost since 1860. In the case of peatlands, about 80% of UK peatlands is in a dried out or degraded state. Globally, around 15% of peatlands have been lost and a further 10% degraded. The UK and Ireland are particularly important for their share of the world's blanket bog, as I mentioned before. However, there are attempts to start to protect and conserve what we have. A great example is the Flow Country in the far north of Scotland. This represents a large and important area of intact blanket bog. It was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site as recently as 2024. And it's the first peatland to have this status. Along with recent additions to Ramsar's list of protected wetlands, we are seeing an increasing effort to preserve what remains. And there are also efforts underway to restore degraded wetlands and to create new wetland habitat. But unfortunately, these initiatives aren't yet of sufficient scale to compensate for the losses elsewhere.
Okay, so you've identified the fact that these are starting to be replenished and changed, but you also stated that since the 1600s, these have been in decline. So why should we actually care about wetlands now?
There are so many reasons why. Aside from their intrinsic value as biodiverse habitats that have their own distinctive and interesting ecological and environmental features, intact and healthy wetlands offer numerous benefits for society. The overarching concept that's helpful here is the idea of ecosystem services. This describes how ecosystems have provisioning, regulating, and supporting functions that would be costly, if not impossible, for people to replace artificially if the ecosystem is degraded or lost. As for provisioning, about 75% of commercially valuable fish and shellfish species depend on coastal wetlands for some part of their life cycle. For regulating, salt marshes, mangrove swamps, and seagrass meadows are highly productive ecosystems, among the most productive in the world, that take in a lot of carbon dioxide. And with an average absorption or sequestration rate of over 100 grams of carbon per square meter per year, these ecosystems can be around 50 times more effective as carbon sinks than forests. So their preservation and restoration, alongside forests, of course, is an essential part of efforts to offset carbon emissions and to eventually bring down the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide. Coastal wetlands also absorb wave energy and regulate tidal flows and the movement of sediment along coasts. So they're a really important natural form of defense for coastal settlements, lowering the risk of flooding through their capacity to slow the movement of water and to store excess water from storm surges. And the ecosystem service will only become more important as sea level continues to rise due to our carbon emissions that are warming the atmosphere and oceans. Some supporting functions of wetlands include their importance as habitat for migratory birds and many other species that may be temporary or permanent inhabitants, and as places for outdoor recreation and tourism. Looking at inland or terrestrial wetlands, there are many of the same ecosystem services. In fact, it's amazing that despite covering only 3% of the world's land surface, about 600 gigatons of carbon are stored in the world's peatlands, and this is about twice as much as all the carbon stored in the world's forests. Peatlands also reduce flood risk by absorbing precipitation, storing excess water, and slowing the flow of water towards rivers. and they act as buffers to agricultural, industrial, or domestic pollutants running off the land that would otherwise find their way to a river, a lake, or to groundwater. So given all this, it may seem surprising that for most of human history, wetlands have been undervalued and have been viewed negatively. Well into the 20th century, the objective in most societies has been to drain wetlands and to put them into productive or commercial use, be it for grazing animals, growing crops, or harvesting peat for fuel or compost. And wetlands near coasts and rivers have also often been drained and developed for economic uses such as industry, agriculture, tourism, and for housing. And wetlands were also seen as places of pestilence until modern medical research revealed the mechanisms behind waterborne diseases and vector-borne infections such as malaria. And so the idea of wetlands as being forbidding, dangerous, unpleasant places that should be drained is really quite deeply rooted in human psyche. And you even see this represented a lot in art and literature. I think, for example, of the Grimpen Mire in Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Hound of the Baskervilles, the dangerous mire on Dartmoor, or the dead marshes of the Two Towers in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings trilogy. So sadly, wetlands are an ecosystem that is undervalued or has been undervalued for a long time and misunderstood.
Yeah, I see what you mean. They definitely are considered as these dangerous places that maybe are just a little bit further out of reach and very much conjure up that kind of fear. But what you've just said is that they're incredibly value to both the water and the carbon cycle in making sure that there is an equilibrium between the two.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so in this podcast, we were talking about wetlands, but we're also talking about nature-based solutions. Can you just explain to the audience what a nature-based solution actually is?
Sure. For thinking about this, we need to remember ecosystem services as well, because the two concepts are really closely linked. Nature-based solutions, we're aiming to use natural processes for solving problems, which would otherwise be very expensive or perhaps impossible with hard engineering methods. A little bit of history behind the concept. In the early to mid-20th century especially, governments in industrialized countries tended to subscribe to the idea that large artificial structures and systems could conquer nature, that problems such as river flooding, landsliding, and coastal erosion could be solved through hard engineering. And this was a time when many of the largest dams, levees, tidal barriers, and other coastal defenses were built. However, as the understanding of environmental systems has improved, and having learned the hard way from natural disasters that engineering structures can be overwhelmed, and that the expense required to eliminate all risk is prohibitive, nature-based solutions have become a more attractive option to policymakers and simply more widely known about. And this isn't to say that hard engineering doesn't have its place, just that more cost-effective and sustainable solutions in many cases is going to involve a combination of hard engineering where appropriate, but also working with nature to mitigate impacts and adapting human activities to build resilience.
Definitely. So the idea that actually nature really got it right in the first place and humans have just been interfering is very much the kind of concept you've brought across there. If we think about wetlands, how are they a nature-based solution?
I'd say that they can be a nature-based solution to a number of problems, but perhaps the prime example is as a nature-based solution to the threat of flooding, especially in low-lying coastlines. So salt marsh and other types of coastal wetlands, such as in the tropics, the mangrove swamps, are a really critical line of defense. And bearing in mind that about 10% of the global population occupy areas less than 10 meters above sea level, and with continued sea level rise, to have nature provide a buffer to wave action, to storm surge, to coastal flooding is something that should be developed further. And it's obviously a lot less expensive than building huge seawalls.
And these populations around these areas have actually worked with the wetlands for centuries, and throughout their own cultural history actually have a really good understanding of looking after these places.
That is absolutely true. And I'd even go on to say that many of the areas along coasts that have been developed by people for commercial reasons who aren't necessarily from the area that they're actually developing. So they may be less attuned and aware of this the natural effects. The idea that, as we all know, if you do something to the coast in one place, you're going to affect the coast further along.
Yeah, indeed. Can you describe some of the methods that are being used to restore the wetlands?
There are a lot of methods. Of course, each method needs to be tailored to the type of wetland that you're looking at. And there are many different organizations that are working to restore wetlands. I might just start by giving the example of the Wetlands project, which is one that I'm more familiar with. And they're using many different methods to restore different kinds of wetlands across Europe. It's an EU-funded project. It's coordinated from University College Dublin. And Shane McGuinness, a co-director of the project, and we had the opportunity to visit one of the action sites in Ireland last year to see the progress and to talk to the people involved. And so this area in the Cuilca and Éireann uplands in County Cavan, Ireland, is very important for its extensive blanket bogs. And restoration work here is focused on raising the water table and repairing damage caused by erosion, peat cutting, and invasive species. In the past, ditches were dug into the peat to drain the land for farming, and this caused areas of blanket peat to dry out, which in turn changed the ecology, caused peat erosion, and raised the flood risk at lower elevations. And so one method is a simple one, is just by blocking the old drainage systems. The water is held longer in the peatland, so the water table rises, and then the sphagnum mosses and other peat-forming plants can reestablish. Geotextiles are also used. These are made of natural fibers that biodegrade, and these are placed on areas of eroding peat to reduce overland flow when it rains. So this helps to hold the surface in place, reduces erosion, and makes it easier for the plants to reestablish. I've also had the opportunity to observe work being done to restore salt marsh in the Venice Lagoon, and this is another of Waterland's action sites working in partnership with the NGO We Are Here Venice. The loss of salt marsh in the area, in the lagoon, by about 70% over the last century is a contributing factor to the increasing frequency and height of high water events, which in Italian is termed acqua alta, that have caused major problems for the city. There is a huge engineering scheme known as the Mosè Tidal Barrier Scheme, and this does offer a hard engineering defense designed for high magnitude storm surges. However, the salt marsh is still very important for slowing the tidal flows of water daily between the lagoon and the Adriatic Sea. And this reduces erosion, it lowers the flood risk for the city of Venice and the other settled islands within the lagoon. And so in addition to protecting the existing salt marsh in the lagoon with gabions and wooden pilings, there's also sediment nourishment, there is replanting of eroded salt marsh areas, and there's also a project of dredging sediment from other places and placing it at various points inside the lagoon as infill and seeding at these infills with the right sorts of plants to create new areas of salt marsh or reestablish areas of salt marsh that have since been lost so that that total area within the lagoon can increase, which again provides a really effective buffer and way of slowing down water flows in and out of the Adriatic.
Fantastic. I'm really interested in hearing about how nature is helping nature here. And you talked about something called geotextiles when you visited Ireland. Could you give us, our listeners, a little bit more about what that actually is and how that's actually involved in helping nature to support nature?
Yeah, the idea with the geotextiles is that certainly if you're going to use something to help a habitat, if it biodegrades naturally, that's a big plus. The geotextiles that we saw, even after a few years, they start to break down, and they are carefully chosen so that they don't negatively impact the ecology of the actual peat bog itself. Now, what's slightly odd and surprised me when we were in the Cuilca and Éireann area is that the prime material for these geotextiles is fiber from coconuts. And that is odd, considering how, and you could argue, well, the coconuts are sourced from quite far away. Isn't there something you can use more locally? And there has been discussion of using, for example, wool. Of course, the price of wool has dropped massively, and that obviously impacts the ability of sheep farmers to make a living. I don't remember the exact details, but there are some reasons why the coconut fibers do work better and are more ecologically appropriate than doing this with wool fibers. But yes, it's an interesting area of thinking what are the right sorts of natural materials to use for these kinds of restoration projects.
Definitely, because I don't think coconuts are indigenous of Ireland by any means.
Certainly not.
So we're thinking about the future here. So how optimistic are you for the future of wetlands? What can individuals do to protect and enhance them?
I would say, maybe it's a cliche, but cautiously optimistic is the two words I would go for. So although we are seeing a continued decline in wetlands worldwide, at least awareness of their value is increasing. And there are many examples of successful efforts to protect and restore them. As with so many environmental problems, we know what the solutions are. It's really just a matter of scaling them up. It can also be said that compared with many other ecosystems, wetlands can recover quite quickly under the right conditions. And when I was in Ireland at the Cuilca and Yearan Action Site, I was struck by how much progress in restoring the blanket bog habitat had been made in a short amount of time. And as for salt marsh, it only takes a few years for it to establish to a point where its ecosystem services become valuable, even if it takes decades for it to reach a fully mature state. As individuals, perhaps our main power is how we behave collectively in supporting environmental causes and as ethical consumers. We should avoid buying products that either directly or indirectly cause wetland loss or degradation and look for alternatives. Examples include buying peat-free compost for your garden, or looking for eco-labels such as ASC, Aquaculture Stewardship Council, on a pack of prawns, for example, to avoid contributing to the loss of mangrove swamps for shrimp and prawn farming. Lastly, I'd encourage listeners to experience some wetland environments for themselves, be it on a walkway, in a boat, or in a bird hide. The more that people value wetlands and enjoy experiencing their tranquility and beauty, the more incentive there will be to protect them, and communities that gain from their wetlands, whether this be socially, economically, or culturally, or a combination of all three, they'll have a vested interest in their conservation, and this is what we have to hope for.
David, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. It's been fascinating to hear not only about the extraordinary diversity and value of wetlands, but also the optimism we can hold for their future when we choose to work with natural systems rather than against them. These examples that you've shared with us today highlight how quickly these ecosystems can rebound when given the chance. For our listeners, if today's conversation has sparked your interests, there are plenty of ways to get involved. Seek out a wetland near you, whether it's a local salt marsh, a stretch of river floodplain, or a nature reserve restoring peatlands, and experience firsthand the biodiversity and calm they offer you as people. David, thank you again for joining us, and thank you all for listening. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to subscribe to the Ask the Geographer podcast series on soundcloud.com or your preferred streaming platform. Dive deeper into the world of geography and stay informed with our wide range of resources, many of which are available for free. School membership grants access to even more resources, including online lectures and supporting materials for both teachers and learners. Explore our resources and discover our additional offers for education at www.rgs.org/schools.